I never thought I'd hear my own son haggling over the price of my corpse. But there I was, listening to him calculate how much my death would be worth to his gambling debts. Look, Mom, that old watch isn't going to pay for itself to sit in your jewelry box. You're 79. What are you waiting for? A miracle? Sell it now, or I'll sell it for you when you're gone. And trust me, you won't like my asking price. David's words hit me like ice water as he reached for my husband's gold pocket watch, the one sacred thing I had left of my 45-year marriage to Henry. But it wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Like I was already dead. Like my feelings, my memories, my grief meant absolutely nothing compared to the cash he could get from pawning the last piece of my beloved husband. The afternoon sun streaming through my modest California living room seemed to spotlight this moment of betrayal, casting harsh shadows across my son's face as he stood there with his hand outstretched, waiting for me to surrender the one treasure I'd protected for 37 years since Henry passed. My name is Verenius, and at 79, I thought I understood cruelty. I survived the Depression eating dandelion soup and wearing shoes with holes until my feet bled. I buried my husband, my best friend, my soulmate, my everything, and learned to wake up every morning in a bed that felt like a grave. I worked myself to the bone, putting my ungrateful son through law school, cleaning offices at dawn and stocking shelves at midnight so he could have the opportunities I never had. But nothing prepared me for the moment my only child would look at the symbol of the greatest love I'd ever known and see nothing but dollar signs. This gold pocket watch wasn't just jewelry to me, it was Henry's heartbeat, still ticking after all these years. It was the weight of his hand in mine during Sunday church services, the gentle sound that helped me fall asleep when grief made the nights endless. The last physical connection to a man who treated me like a queen for 45 beautiful years. I had dreamed of placing it in my grandson's hands someday, of telling him about his grandfather's courage in World War II, his kindness to everyone he met, his unwavering love for his family. I wanted to see that same pride in my grandson's eyes that I once saw in Henry's when he checked this watch and declared it was time to come home to his girls. But as David stood there in my living room, his patience wearing thin, his wife Jennifer nodding encouragement from the doorway, I realized my son had been measuring my life in terms of what he could inherit for months. Every visit wasn't about love or concern. It was an appraisal session, calculating how much my death would be worth to his mounting gambling debts. And that's when I knew everything was about to change. Let me take you back to where this all began, because understanding how I got here matters more than you might think. 54 years ago, I was Verenius May Thompson, 25 years old, dancing in Henry Patterson's arms at the Riverside Ballroom in downtown Sacramento. He was 27, fresh back from Korea, with gentle hands that had seen too much war and eyes that still believed in. Forever. When he proposed 6 months later, he got down on one knee and pulled out that gold pocket watch, his grandfather's, passed down through 3 generations of Patterson men who knew how to love their women right. This watch has kept perfect time through 2 wars and 40 years of marriage, he said, his voice shaking with emotion. I wanted to time our love story too. We married in 1969, and I thought I had it all figured out. Henry worked construction, building the subdivisions that were sprawling across California like wildflowers after rain. I taught second grade at Lincoln Elementary, watching other people's children grow up while dreaming of my own. Every evening, Henry would check that watch and announce, 5:30, sweetheart. Time to come home to my girls. When David was born in 1971, Henry cried harder than I did. He held that tiny wrinkled baby like he was made of spun glass, whispering promises about teaching him to fish, to drive, to be a good man. This little guy's going to inherit more than just a watch, he said. He's going to inherit a legacy. For 18 beautiful years, we lived that legacy. Henry coached Little League every Saturday, taught David to change oil, and treat women with respect. I packed lunches with love notes, attended every school play and science fair, saved every report card like it was a treasure map to our son's future. We weren't rich. Construction work is feast or famine. But our home was filled with laughter, Sunday dinners, and the steady tick, tick, tick of Henry's watch marking time in a house where time meant family. When Henry was diagnosed with lung cancer in 1987, he fought it like the warrior he'd always been. But cancer doesn't care about love stories or pocket watches or 18-year-old sons who need their fathers. The night before he died, he pressed that watch into my hands, his fingers barely strong enough to hold it. Promise me, he whispered, his voice a shadow of the strong man who used to announce dinner time. Promise me you'll give this to David when he's ready to be the man I tried to raise him to be. I promised. Of course I promised. What else do you do when the love of your life is slipping away and asking for one last gift? After the funeral, David changed. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was being 24 and suddenly the only man in his mother's life. But the respectful boy who had sat at our kitchen table doing homework became someone I barely recognized. College had filled his head with big ideas and expensive tastes. Law school buried him in debt and taught him to see everything as a transaction. I kept teaching for another 15 years, stretching every paycheck to help with his loans, his first apartment, his wedding to Jennifer, a woman who looked at my modest teacher's pension like it was personally insulting to her lifestyle expectations. I retired at 67, thinking my golden years would be filled with grandchildren and Sunday dinners, keeping Henry's memory alive through stories and love. Instead, I got 37 years of loneliness, punctuated by visits from a son who saw me as his financial safety net and a daughter-in-law who couldn't hide her contempt for the woman who had given her husband everything. The first crack in my illusions came on a Tuesday morning in March, disguised as concern. Mom, we need to talk about your finances. David sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where Henry used to announce dinner time, where I'd helped David with homework for 12 years. But now his voice carried the cold authority of a lawyer, not the warmth of a son. Jennifer stood behind him like a sentinel, her designer purse clutched tight against her chest, her eyes scanning my modest kitchen like she was pricing everything for an estate sale. Your Social Security and pension aren't going to stretch forever, he continued, pulling out a manila folder thick with papers. We've been talking, and Jennifer thinks, we think, it might be time to start making some practical decisions about your assets. Assets. He called the remnants of my life with Henry assets. I'm managing just fine, sweetheart, I said, my hands automatically reaching for the sugar bowl to offer them coffee, the same maternal instinct that had been serving my family for 54 years. I've got everything I need right here. Jennifer's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. Mother Patterson, with respect, living on $1,500 a month isn't managing fine. It's barely surviving. And when you get sick, and you will get sick, who do you think is going to pay for your care? The way she said, Mother Patterson, made my name sound like a burden she was forced to carry. I watched her eyes inventory my kitchen. The vintage Pyrex bowls Henry bought me for our 10th anniversary, the hand-embroidered dish towels my mother made, the small collection of ceramic roosters that had taken me 20 years to collect, from garage sales and church bazaars. David, honey, I don't understand what you're getting at, I said, though something cold was already settling in my stomach like a stone. He opened the folder and spread documents across my table. Insurance forms, property assessments, something that looked suspiciously like a financial power of attorney. We're just being proactive, Mom. Planning ahead. You know Dad would want us to take care of you properly. There it was. The first time he'd invoked his father's memory as a weapon instead of a blessing. These papers would just give us the ability to help manage things when you're not able to, Jennifer added sweetly, but her smile reminded me of the cats that used to hunt the birds in my garden. Make the hard decisions so you don't have to worry about them. I stared at the documents, my reading glasses fogging up in the steam from my untouched coffee cup. The language was dense, full of legal terms that made my head spin, but I caught enough phrases to understand what they were really asking. Guardianship, financial conservatorship, the right to make decisions about my property, my health care, my life. I appreciate your concern, I said carefully, but I'm 79, not 99. My mind is sharp as it's ever been, and I'm nowhere near ready to hand over control of my life to anyone. David's jaw tightened, the same expression he had worn as a child when he didn't get his way. Mom, be reasonable. What happens if you fall and break a hip? What if you have a stroke? We're trying to help you here. Help me or help yourselves? The question slipped out before I could stop it, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Jennifer's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something hard and calculating underneath. I think what David means is that it would be irresponsible not to plan for every contingency, especially when there are valuable items that need to be properly managed. My hand instinctively moved to my chest, where Henry's watch hung on a chain beneath my blouse. I'd started wearing it close to my heart after David's first casual inquiry about its value 6 months ago, when he'd picked it up from my nightstand and asked if I'd ever had it appraised. The watch isn't for sale, I said quietly. No one said anything about selling anything, David replied, but his eyes betrayed him. I'd seen that same look when he was 8 years old and denied eating the cookies I'd baked for the church social. We just want to make sure everything is documented, properly insured, protected. As they gathered their papers and prepared to leave, empty-handed for now, I realized this wasn't a conversation about my well-being. This was reconnaissance. They were mapping out their inheritance while I was still breathing, cataloging what they considered theirs by right of survival. After they left, I sat alone in my kitchen, Henry's watch ticking steadily against my heart, and understood that the war for my dignity had just begun. What started as subtle manipulation quickly became outright exploitation, and I was too blinded by love to see how deep their claws had already sunk into my life. It began with the grocery bills. David started showing up every Thursday, always when I was getting ready to go shopping, with a concerned expression and a calculator app open on his phone. Mom, I looked at your credit card statement. $87 at Safeway? What are you buying, caviar? He'd hold up my receipts like evidence in a courtroom, shaking his head with theatrical disappointment. Organic vegetables, name brand cereal, real butter instead of margarine. Do you think money grows on trees? I tried to explain that my doctor had recommended better nutrition for my arthritis, that the cheap food made me feel sick. But David wasn't interested in my health. He was interested in my bank account. From now on, Jennifer will do your shopping, he declared. She's got a good eye for deals, and frankly, you're too generous for your own good. Jennifer's idea of deals meant generic everything: expired meat marked down for quick sale, and vegetables that were already turning brown. When I gently suggested that the milk tasted sour, she rolled her eyes and said, "Beggars can't be choosers, Mother Patterson." Maybe if you hadn't spent 40 years teaching other people's brats for peanuts, you'd have champagne taste money. The humiliation cut deeper than the bad food. Here was a woman who had never worked a day in her life, whose entire existence was funded by my son's career. A career I had made possible by sacrificing my own financial security for his education, lecturing me about fiscal responsibility. But the grocery control was just the beginning. "Mom, you're wasting electricity," became David's new greeting every time he walked into my house. He'd march through my rooms like an inspector, turning off lights I was still using, adjusting my thermostat down to temperatures that left me shivering in my own home. 72 degrees? Are you trying to heat the whole neighborhood? 65 is plenty for someone your age. When I protested that I couldn't feel warm at 65 degrees, that my arthritis ached in the cold, Jennifer laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Put on a sweater. Poor people have been staying warm with extra clothes for centuries." Poor people. That's what I had become in their eyes. The worst part was how they made me feel guilty for existing. Every visit included a recitation of their financial struggles. David's gambling losses disguised as investment setbacks, Jennifer's shopping sprees rebranded as networking expenses for David's career. They painted a picture of a young couple drowning in debt while their selfish elderly mother lived in luxury on her government checks. "We can barely make our mortgage payment," Jennifer would sigh dramatically while examining her fresh manicure. But of course, Mom's comfort comes first. They started timing my showers, monitoring my phone calls, questioning every small pleasure I allowed myself. When I bought a birthday card for my neighbor's granddaughter, 79 cents. David found the receipt and confronted me like I'd committed fraud. 79 cents might not seem like much to you, but that adds up, he said, his voice cold as January wind. Maybe instead of buying cards for strangers, you should think about helping your family. But the cruelest cut came when I fell in my bathroom on a Sunday morning. Nothing serious, just a slip on the wet tiles that left me with a bruised hip and shaken confidence. When I called David for help, his response chilled me to the bone. "I'm not your personal paramedic, Mom. You're going to have to learn to be more careful. Jennifer and I can't drop everything every time you have a senior moment." A senior moment. A fall in my own bathroom had become evidence of my incompetence. He did come over eventually, 3 hours later, and only after Jennifer reminded him that a hospital visit would be expensive. But instead of comfort or concern, he spent the entire visit lecturing me about safety while Jennifer photographed my bruises with her phone. For insurance purposes, she claimed, though I wondered if she was actually documenting evidence for a future competency hearing. As they left that day, I heard Jennifer whisper to David in my driveway, her voice carrying through my open window. How much longer do you think we'll have to keep this up? She's becoming more trouble than she's worth. David's response was too quiet for me to hear, but his laughter was crystal clear. Sitting alone in my house, ice pack pressed against my bruised hip, I realized that I wasn't their mother or their family anymore. I was their burden, their inconvenience, their obstacle to an inheritance they felt they'd already earned. The moment that shattered my world came disguised as a simple errand. Mom, I need to borrow your car for a few hours, David said, on a Thursday afternoon in October, his voice casual, almost bored. Jennifer's Mercedes is in the shop, and we have some business to take care of across town. Eh? I handed over my keys without question. The same maternal instinct that had been serving my ungrateful family for decades. They'd borrowed my car before, usually returning it with an empty gas tank and Jennifer's expensive perfume lingering in the fabric like a territorial marking. But this time felt different. David's hands were shaking slightly as he took the keys, and Jennifer wouldn't meet my eyes. They left in a hurry, their voices urgent and hushed as they walked to my old Honda Civic parked in the driveway. 3 hours later, they returned with forced smiles and elaborate explanations about traffic and errands that didn't quite make sense. David handed me my keys with exaggerated casualness, kissing my forehead like the devoted son he pretended to be in public. It wasn't until the next morning that I discovered what they'd really done. I was looking for my reading glasses in my purse when my fingers found something that didn't belong. A crumpled piece of paper wedged deep in the corner of the inside pocket. I pulled it out, smoothed it against my kitchen table, and felt my entire world collapse in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Golden State Pawn Shop, item, gold pocket watch, antique, description. Engraved to Henry, all my love, Margaret, 1969. Appraised value, $1,200. Transaction, sold. Date, October 15th, 2024. The receipt trembled in my hands like a dying bird. The date was yesterday, the day they'd borrowed my car, the day they'd claimed to be running errands across town. My son had sold his father's watch, the symbol of 45 years of marriage, the last physical connection I had to the love of my life, the treasure I'd protected for 37 years, to pay off his gambling debts. And he'd used my car to do it. But it wasn't just the betrayal that destroyed me. It was the calculation behind it. They'd waited until I was completely dependent on them, until they'd isolated me from friends and made me question my own judgment, until they'd convinced me I was a burden who should be grateful for their attention. Then they'd stolen the one thing that meant more to me than my own life. The watch wasn't just gone, it was sold. Some stranger was walking around with Henry's heartbeat ticking in their pocket, completely unaware that they were carrying pieces of my soul. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at that receipt until the numbers blurred through my tears, and I understood, with perfect, crystalline clarity, that this had never been about financial necessity or family responsibility. This was theft. This was elder abuse. This was my own child treating me like a resource to be exploited until there was nothing left but bones and ashes. The sound of my front door opening made me look up. David and Jennifer walked in without knocking. They'd stopped asking permission to enter my house months ago. Both of them carrying shopping bags from expensive stores. Jennifer was wearing a new designer jacket that probably cost more than my monthly pension, and David had a new watch on his wrist. Not his father's watch. A gaudy digital thing that looked like it belonged on the wrist of someone half his age. "Hi, Mom," David said cheerfully, as if he hadn't just committed the cruelest act of betrayal in our family's history. "Hope you don't mind. We let ourselves in." I held up the receipt, my hand steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "Where is your father's watch, David?" The color drained from his face so fast I thought he might faint. Jennifer's new jacket suddenly looked heavy on her shoulders, like she was wearing guilt instead of wool. "Mom, I can explain. Where is it?" I stood up slowly, the receipt still clutched in my hand, like evidence in a murder trial. "Where is the watch your father wore every day for 45 years?" "The watch he gave me on his deathbed? The watch that was supposed to go to your son someday?" David's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. I. We needed. You don't understand the pressure we're under financially." $1,200, I said quietly. 45 years of marriage, 37 years of widowhood, a family legacy 3 generations in the making. You sold it all for $1,200. And that's when I knew that some betrayals are so deep, so fundamentally wrong, that they change the chemical composition of love itself. The silence in my kitchen stretched like a rubber band about to snap. David and Jennifer stood frozen by my front door, their shopping bags full of purchases made with Henry's memory, waiting for me to collapse into the broken old woman they'd spent months trying to create. But something had shifted inside me when I'd seen that pawn shop receipt. Something fundamental and irreversible. The part of me that had spent 79 years being accommodating, understanding, and endlessly forgiving had died the moment I realized my son had used my car to sell my husband's soul. "Sit down," I said quietly, my voice steady as steel. "Both of you, sit down right now." They obeyed, probably more from shock than respect, settling into the kitchen chairs like children called to account by a principal. Jennifer's new jacket rustled nervously, and David's hands shook as he placed them flat on my table. I walked to my bedroom, my steps measured and deliberate, and returned with a small wooden box Henry had made for me in his workshop 40 years ago. Inside were documents I hadn't looked at in years, important papers I'd always assumed would matter someday, when someday finally arrived. "David," I said, placing my hands flat on the table, mirroring his posture but with none of his trembling. "Do you remember what your father said to you the night before he died?" His face went pale. "Mom, please, answer me." My voice cut through his protest like a blade through silk. "What did he say?" "He said," David's voice cracked like a teenager's. "He said to take care of you. To be the man he'd raised me to be." "That's right." I opened the wooden box and pulled out my will, the document David and Jennifer had been so eager to discuss for months. "He said to take care of me. Not to exploit me, not to steal from me, not to treat me like a bank account with a pulse." Jennifer leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the papers in my hands. "Mother Patterson, if this is about the watch, we can explain." "Explain what?" I looked at her directly for the first time in months. really looked at her and saw what I should have seen years ago: a predator who had married my son for access to whatever inheritance she imagined I possessed. Explain how you convinced my son to steal the most precious thing I owned? Explain how you spent the money on shopping while I've been eating expired food and shivering in my own house? I picked up my will, held it in both hands, and tore it in half. The sound of ripping paper echoed through my kitchen like thunder. David lurched forward as if he could somehow put the pieces back together. But I was already tearing the halves into quarters, the quarters into eighths, until my last will and testament was nothing but confetti scattered across my kitchen table. "What are you doing?" Jennifer's voice climbed toward hysteria. "You can't just—" "I can do whatever I want," I said calmly. "This is still my house, bought with my money, filled with my memories. And I'm still alive, despite your obvious impatience for me to be otherwise." David found his voice, though it came out strangled and desperate. "Mom, you're upset. I understand that. But destroying legal documents isn't going to solve anything. We can work this out. We can get the watch back." "No." The word came out like a judge's gavel. "You can't get it back. Someone else owns it now, just like someone else will own everything I have when I die. But it won't be you." I reached into the wooden box again and pulled out the business card my neighbor had given me months ago, an estate attorney who specialized in elder law. I'd kept it out of politeness, never imagining I'd need it. Now it felt like salvation in rectangular cardboard form. "You want to know what I'm going to do?" I stood up, suddenly feeling taller than I had in years. "I'm going to call this attorney tomorrow morning. I'm going to create a new will. And neither of you will get a single penny." The room exploded into chaos. Jennifer sobbing, David shouting, both of them talking at once, making promises and threats and desperate bargains. But their voices sounded far away, like noise from a television in another room. I had found my backbone at 79 years old, and I was finally ready to use it. The next morning, I woke up before dawn for the first time in months, not from anxiety or arthritis pain, but from excitement. For the first time since Henry died, I had a purpose that belonged entirely to me. At exactly 9 a.m., I called the estate attorney whose card I'd clutched like a lifeline through the sleepless night. Margaret Hendricks had a voice like warm honey over steel, and when I told her I needed help protecting myself from my own family, she didn't sound shocked or judgmental. She sounded like she'd heard the story before. "Mrs. Patterson, I want you to know that what happened to you is called financial elder abuse, and it's a crime. You have options, and we're going to explore every single one of them." 2 days later, I sat in Attorney Hendrick's office, a stack of documents spread across her conference table like battle plans. She'd already contacted the pawn shop where David had sold Henry's watch, but as we'd feared, it had been purchased by a private collector within hours of the transaction. My husband's legacy was gone forever, but the legal implications of its theft were just beginning. "Your son used your vehicle to transport stolen property," Attorney Hendricks explained, her pen moving swiftly across a legal pad. "He had no legal right to that watch, and the fact that he had you unknowingly aid in the crime makes this even more serious. We can file charges if you want to, criminal charges, against my own son. 6 months ago, the idea would have horrified me. Now, it felt like justice wearing her proper clothes." But legal action was just the beginning of my revolution. I opened a new bank account at a different branch, one where David and Jennifer had never accompanied me, never charmed the tellers, never positioned themselves as my helpful financial advisors. I transferred my pension and Social Security to the new account, changed all my passwords, and added two-factor authentication to everything electronic in my life. Then I called a locksmith. I need all my locks changed, I told him over the phone. Today, if possible. And I want deadbolts on every door. When David showed up Thursday for his usual financial interrogation, he found his key didn't work. I watched from my living room window as he tried it again and again, his frustration building with each failed attempt. When he finally rang the doorbell, I opened the door with the security chain still attached, a barrier as symbolic as it was practical. "What's wrong with my key?" he demanded, his face flushed with anger and entitlement. "Nothing's wrong with your key," I replied calmly. "But this isn't your house, and you're no longer welcome here without an invitation." Jennifer appeared behind him, her arms crossed over her expensive jacket. "Mother Patterson, this is ridiculous. We're family. Family doesn't steal from each other." I let that sink in for a moment before continuing. "Attorney Hendricks says what you did to Henry's watch constitutes felony theft. She's very eager to file charges." The blood drained from David's face so fast, I thought he might collapse on my doorstep. "Mom, you can't be serious. You wouldn't actually—" "I have an appointment with Detective Morrison at the Sacramento Police Department tomorrow at 10 a.m. I watched as the reality of consequences, real, legal, life-altering consequences, finally penetrated his gambling-addled brain. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to discuss restitution. Restitution? Jennifer's voice cracked like ice on a frozen pond. I pulled out a piece of paper I'd prepared with Attorney Hendricks' help, a detailed accounting of everything they'd taken, manipulated, or stolen over the past 18 months. The watch was just the beginning. There were the groceries purchased with money meant for my medications, the utility bills paid with guilt and manipulation, the emotional trauma of being made to feel worthless in my own home. $1,200 for the watch, plus the cost of having my locks changed, plus attorney fees, plus compensation for emotional distress. Total, $5,000. You have 30 days. David's laugh was desperate, bordering on hysterical. $5,000? Mom, we don't have $5,000. That's why we... Then you'll have to figure it out. I began to close the door, then paused. "Oh, and David? Your father would be ashamed of what you've become. But I'm not ashamed anymore. I'm angry. And angry turns out to be much more useful than sad." I closed the door and turned the new deadbolt with a satisfying click that echoed through my house like a declaration of independence. Through the window, I watched them stand on my porch for 10 minutes, arguing in whispers, before finally walking back to their car, a car they'd probably have to sell to pay me back. For the first time in months, that thought made me smile. 3 weeks after I changed my locks, something miraculous happened. I remembered who I used to be. It started small, sleeping until 7 a.m. instead of lying awake worrying about grocery money. Buying the good coffee again, the kind that actually tasted like coffee instead of burnt water. Setting my thermostat to 72 degrees and not feeling guilty about the warmth spreading through my arthritis-weary bones. But The real transformation began when I stopped jumping every time the phone rang, stopped checking my locks 3 times before bed, stopped walking on eggshells in my own home. I was free. My neighbor, Dorothy Chen, knocked on my door one Tuesday morning with a plate of homemade scones and eyes full of concern. Verenis, I heard shouting last week. Are you all right, dear? For months, I'd been too ashamed to admit the truth to anyone. The humiliation of being exploited by your own child feels like a failure of motherhood. Like somehow you deserved the cruelty because you raised the person delivering it. But sitting in my living room with Dorothy, sharing real coffee and honest conversation, I found myself telling the whole story. She listened without judgment, nodding in the right places, her face growing sadder and angrier with each detail. When I finished, she reached across and squeezed my hand with the grip of someone who understood survival. My sister went through something similar with her daughter, she said quietly. The shame nearly killed her. But you know what she told me afterward? She said the day she chose herself over their manipulation was the day she started living again. Dorothy introduced me to her book club, 6 women between the ages of 68 and 84, who met every Thursday at the community center to discuss novels and, more importantly, to discuss life. They welcomed me like I'd been missing from their circle for years, instead of never having belonged to it at all. Through them, I discovered a whole world of activities I'd forgotten existed. Senior water aerobics at the YMCA, where I learned my body could still move with grace and strength. A ceramics class where I created bowls and vases with my own hands, pieces that would never be sold or stolen because they were mine alone. A volunteer position reading to children at the library, where my voice mattered again, where little faces lit up when I walked into the room. The children especially healed something broken inside me. They didn't see a burden or a bank account when they looked at me. They saw stories and kindness and someone who made funny voices during picture books. They saw the grandmother I'd never gotten to be, the one David and Jennifer had denied me access to by poisoning every family gathering with their presence. For the first time in decades, I started making plans that stretched beyond next month's bills. I booked a trip to Carmel, a weekend getaway Henry and I had always promised ourselves, but never took. I enrolled in a senior college course on California history, something I'd wanted to study for years, but had convinced myself was too frivolous. I bought new furniture, not expensive pieces, just a comfortable reading chair that was mine alone, a small dining table that fit my new life perfectly, cheerful yellow curtains that made my kitchen look like sunshine lived there permanently. The most surprising change was how differently people treated me. The bank teller who had started speaking to me like I was confused and helpless suddenly began asking about my weekend plans. The grocery store clerks engaged in actual conversations instead of rushed transactions. My doctor spent more time listening to my concerns instead of attributing everything to normal aging. I realized that confidence is contagious. When you stop apologizing for existing, stop making yourself smaller to accommodate other people's comfort, the world responds by giving you the respect you've been denying yourself. 6 months after changing my locks, I sat in my sunny kitchen with a cup of good coffee, planning my garden for spring. The silence in my house wasn't lonely anymore. It was peaceful. The tick of my wall clock wasn't counting down to my death. It was marking the moments of my new life. I still missed Henry every day, still wished I could share these small victories with him. But for the first time since he died, I wasn't just surviving his absence, I was thriving in spite of it. A year later, I received an envelope in my mailbox that I almost threw away without opening. The return address was unfamiliar, but something about the careful handwriting made me pause. Inside was a letter from a young man named Marcus Rodriguez, along with a photograph that made my heart skip a beat. There, gleaming against black velvet in the picture, was Henry's gold pocket watch. Dear Mrs. Patterson, the letter began, you don't know me, but I believe I have something that belongs to you. Marcus explained that he was a collector who specialized in vintage timepieces, and he'd purchased Henry's watch from Golden State Pawn Shop over a year ago. He'd been researching its history when he discovered the engraving and decided to track down our family story. What he found, through online records, old newspaper clippings, and conversations with people who knew us, painted a picture of a love story that had been carelessly discarded for gambling money. I can't imagine what it felt like to lose something so precious, he wrote. But I want you to know that your husband's watch has been treated with the respect it deserves. I've had it professionally cleaned and restored, and I'd be honored to return it to where it belongs, with the woman who loved its original owner. I called him that same day, my hands shaking as I dialed the number he'd included. Marcus turned out to be 28 years old, a watchmaker who had inherited his grandfather's passion for timepieces and their stories. When I offered to reimburse him the $1,200 he'd paid, he laughed gently and refused. Mrs. Patterson, some things are worth more than money. This watch belongs with someone who understands its true value. 2 days later, Marcus drove 3 hours from Los Angeles to return Henry's watch to my trembling hands. As I held it for the first time in over a year, listening to its familiar tick, 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 I realized that some kinds of love are so powerful. They find their way home, even when everything seems lost. But the real miracle wasn't getting the watch back. It was discovering that I no longer needed it to feel connected to Henry. In learning to value myself, I'd found the part of him that lived inside my heart, the part that no thief could ever steal. I invited Marcus to stay for dinner, and as we sat at my kitchen table sharing stories about watches and love and family, I understood something profound. Real family isn't always the people you're born with. Sometimes it's the people who choose to honor your story, who see value in your memories, who treat your heart with the care it deserves. David never paid the restitution I demanded. Instead, he and Jennifer simply disappeared from my life, moving to Nevada to escape their debts and, I suspected, to avoid any legal consequences for what they'd done. I heard through Dorothy that they declared bankruptcy within 6 months, that Jennifer had left him for someone with better financial prospects, that he'd been forced to take a job as a night security guard to survive. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, but I felt no guilt either. Some people have to lose everything before they can understand what they threw away, and some people never understand at all. On quiet evenings, I sit in my comfortable reading chair with Henry's watch, ticking softly nearby, and I think about the lessons this year has taught me. I learned that dignity isn't something other people give you. It's something you refuse to let them take away. I learned that it's never too late to choose yourself, to draw boundaries, to demand the respect you deserve. Most importantly, I learned that love without respect isn't love at all. It's manipulation wearing love's costume. The children at the library still light up when I walk into story time. Dorothy and the book club still save me a seat every Thursday. Marcus still calls occasionally to share stories about the watches he's restored and the families he's reunited with their lost treasures. I am 79 years old and I have never been happier. Real family doesn't hide you away in shame. Real family builds a bigger table. And I finally got my seat back. If my story sounds familiar, if you felt the sting of being taken for granted by people who should treasure you, if you've been made to feel like a burden instead of a blessing, if you've ever been told your worth is measured only by what you can give, then listen to me carefully. You are not too old to start over. You are not too weak to stand up for yourself. You are not obligated to accept cruelty just because it comes from family. The watch came back to me, but that's not the real miracle of this story. The real miracle is that I learned to value myself enough to demand better. I learned that respect isn't negotiable, that dignity isn't optional, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone else's destruction. Every Thursday at story time, I see the faces of children who understand something adults often forget, that every person has worth, that every story matters, that kindness should be the default setting of the human heart. If you're struggling with family members who treat you like an ATM instead of a person, remember those children's faces. Remember that you deserve to be seen with that same wonder and respect. Your voice matters. Your boundaries matter. Your peace of mind matters more than anyone else's convenience. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own worth or gave you courage to demand better treatment, please share it. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments about a time when you chose dignity over dependency. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is inspire someone else to be brave. Remember, love without respect isn't love. It's manipulation wearing love's costume. And you, regardless of your age, deserve the real thing. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for seeing my worth. And thank you for remembering your own.